Everybody loves the book of Psalms. It's clearly one of the most popular books of the Old Testament among Jews and among Christians. But why is Psalms so popular? Well, the answer is simple. We see ourselves in this book. We identify with all those struggles and desperate prayers of David and the other psalmists. And somehow we find comfort and encouragement knowing that these men struggled and suffered and cried and prayed just as we do. In this devotional, I want to talk about the struggles David faced throughout his life. And he struggled a lot. Some of his struggles and crises we know very well, but there's much of his life and his many challenges that we probably do not know. At least we don't know all the details, but we can tell that this famous king who lived a hard and difficult life most of his days frequently faced life and death challenges. We know this because we read his Psalms. It would be impossible for me to share all the Davidic passages that describe David's suffering, struggles, prayers, and victories, but let me share a few of them. First, we'll start with a declaration by David where he writes, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquities, who heals all your diseases." When we read the life story of David, we learn about his sins, especially in the case of Bathsheba, but we don't really hear much about David being sick. In fact, we don't hear anything about it as we read the story of his life. Yet in the Psalms, we read several references to David's illnesses. And when he praises the Lord for healing all his diseases, sounds like he was not entirely healthy throughout his life. In Psalm 38, David is particularly graphic about his sickness. He writes, "There is no soundness in my flesh because of your anger, nor any health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head. Like a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. My wounds are foul and festering because of my foolishness." David believed that his terrible sickness was due to his sins and foolishness. Was this immediately after the Bathsheba scandal? Well, maybe, but we cannot say for sure. One thing we can say is that when David became seriously ill, he knew where to go. He prayed to God, and he prayed intensely, and apparently he experienced numerous dramatic divine healings. So he says of God, "Who forgives all your iniquities, who heals all your diseases." Later in this chapter, David writes, "My loved ones and my friends stand aloof from my plague, and my relatives stand afar off." Nowhere in the narrative of David's life do we read about any kind of sickness like this, but keep in mind that what we do know about David, even though it is pretty extensive, is only a fraction of his life. In the biblical narrative, we learn a lot about his early days and his final days, but not nearly so much about his middle-aged years. Most of David's Psalms deal with attacks and wicked schemes coming from men. In Psalm 86, he writes, "O God, the proud have risen against me, and a mob of violent men have sought my life." And in Psalm 70, he laments, "Let them be ashamed and confounded who seek my life. Let them be turned back and confused who desire my hurt." It seems that throughout much of David's life, he was under severe pressure and struggle, sometimes from sickness, but more often from ungodly men who schemed against him. David did not have an easy life by any means. And when he went through yet another challenge and crisis, he did two things. He prayed about his situation, and he wrote about it in what we now call the Psalms. In one psalm, we get an insight as to why his life was this way. David writes, "I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry. He also brought me up out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock, and established my steps. He's put a new song in my mouth, praise to our God. Many will see it and fear, and will trust in the Lord." David is rejoicing here. He's been cast into a horrible pit of some kind, probably not literally, but figuratively. But God delivered him and set his feet on solid rock. David has been given a new song, and he is praising God for yet another answered prayer, another mighty deliverance. But it is the last part of this passage that tells us why. Why was it he must go through all these crises, challenges, and life-threatening scenarios? David says, "Many will see it and fear, and will trust in the Lord." David's challenges and deliverances will be seen and learned of by many people, and it will cause men and women to put their trust in the God that David loved and trusted. In those days, David did not know, nor could he have ever imagined in his wildest dreams just how many people would learn of his struggles and victories. These events in the life of a Jewish king reigning over a tiny nation have been read by millions and millions of people, and they have been a tremendous source of encouragement and faith to them. Who of all Christians everywhere has not turned to the Psalms when they went through their own crises and challenges? My wife Benedicta spent almost an entire year when her health was so bad and she was so sick it looked as though she would not survive that year. She read the Psalms continually during that year as she identified with David and prayed to the God of David in the name of his son Jesus Christ. And of course she did survive and was lifted out of her own pit and placed upon solid rock. And so we see that when God allowed and even directed David to go through these terrible struggles and then provided him amazing victories, he wasn't just concerned about David alone. He was providing all his children with a divine blueprint for challenges and a source of encouragement and faith so that we too can give praise to God and recognize that God is the ultimate deliverer from pits of all kinds. When you compare David with his son Solomon, Solomon would never have been the right guy to write all of these Psalms like David did. His life was too easy and his reign was too peaceful. Jesus Christ provided the ultimate example of this principle. He died on the cross for the sins of the world, and then he was placed in a tomb while his spirit descended to Hades. But 3 days later, God delivered him from that miry clay and terrible pit, raising him from the dead. And the purpose was just what we've been reading about from David, that many might see it and fear and put their trust in the Lord. For whoever calls upon the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, shall be saved. If you followed our ministry and YouTube channels very long, you know that we're involved in many different missions and ministries. We sponsor our popular African Jesus Conference, which is a video series of 20 different video Bible studies and teachings to train African ministers about the paramount importance of teaching and preaching Jesus, as well as personally abiding in Jesus. Benedict and I create YouTube videos of our Bible studies, and we also produce audio podcasts of these studies. I teach a weekly video devotional on all kinds of Bible topics. We sponsor free medical clinics in Africa, along with providing needed food and clothes for African widows and orphans. We need your help. Please consider donating through our link in the description below this video.